This is Building Tomorrow, the Society of Construction Law Australia podcast.
On the show, you'll hear real conversations about what matters most to the people behind the scenes who are shaping Australian construction.
From lawyers and contract administrators to engineers, commercial managers, consultants, and all the other experts forging the future of Australian infrastructure today. I'm Mawona Matanda.
I'm Bijay.
And I'm Jennifer Raphael.
Today on the show, we're talking to Andrew Davies, who is a principal consultant at 9 Degrees Consulting and an experienced professional in the onshore wind energy sector with specialized expertise in multi-contract delivery and split-scope contracting models. Andrew's background uniquely combines technical and commercial skills, enabling him to navigate and address complex challenges in project contracting. In this episode, Andrew will share his career journey, the evolving contracting landscape in the wind farm industry, important considerations for split contracting, and his outlook for the industry trends. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Bijay. Lovely to be here.
Now, let's set the scene for our listeners here. Could you please introduce yourself and share a bit about your career background?
So, as I said, my name is Andrew Davies. I'm the principal consultant at 9 Degrees Consulting, based in Victoria, a few hours from Melbourne, out in the countryside. And I've spent the last decade or so working in renewables, mainly in wind.
That's great. And what particularly attracted you to the wind sector? And I think you recently focusing more on onshore wind and maybe BESS as well. Could you talk to us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so I ended up in the wind industry. I mean, it's a little bit of a funny story. I was working in the automotive industry, and then in 2014, there was a bit of a collapse in Australia of the automotive industry, and I was working in Germany at that time, and my plan was to work for a few years and come back, but I didn't want to join an industry full of unemployed automotive engineers. I thought that was not a great plan, so that's when I went and did a degree in wind, and I did that because I've studied mechanical engineering, and wind is, very much a mechanical thing. It's not like solar panels where nothing moves and it's all electrons and chemistry. So I felt that there was something I could do there that sort of aligned with what I'd learned previously. And yeah, it just felt like a good thing to be involved in. Of course, it's an industry. People are there to make money and make careers in these things, but the byproduct is clean energy. And look, it's been very exciting. It's sort of a huge overhaul of how many societies generate and consume energy. And it's fascinating to be part of, a small part of that, but, part of that process, part of that transformation.
Absolutely. When you mention 2014 as your calling to get onto something new, it is actually a bit of a calling for me, let's say in 2025, similar to you. Now I'm thinking I would really love to build a career in something else as well. So I've also made the switch to offshore wind. So I'm actually quite excited. Now, let's touch a little bit more on the techno-commercial background that you have. It is very interesting when you mentioned that, yes, you studied wind for your master's degree, but you haven't really done academic training in commercial work. So how did you end up in a techno-commercial career experience?
I think it's just the jobs that I happened to be working in. The first job was doing a lot of due diligence on behalf of lenders. And of course, part of that is asking questions around technology, around design, but also a lot of the interest is around managing risks, managing technical risks. Once you get into that topic, it's all about where did the risks land in contracts, who owns the risk, what's the interface between the different contractors, and then there's an exercise in imagining things that could go wrong and how does that play out, where does the cost land. So once you are looking at the level of a project, it becomes commercial quite quickly because the question is really, well, who's paying for this going wrong, or why are we paying for this technology and not some other technology? It becomes commercial very quickly. And the theme sort of continued. Project engineering, as much as it's about making sure, the right bolts turn up on site and the documents make sense and all this sort of stuff, it's also very much about what are we delivering in our agreement? Have we made sure we've done all the right things to prepare? How does our agreement line up with the next contractor, and are there any gaps? And what do we need to give them? What do they need to give us by when? It becomes very commercial very quickly. And Senvion also, I was there as Senvion became insolvent, and then you also learn about new parts of the contract that I'd never really looked at particularly carefully before. Things like transferring of title and all this sort of stuff becomes very real when, at one point no one knew who owned the towers and how that worked at all. For example, even mundane things like that normally aren't terribly important. if everything's going well, but when things are going badly, become really, really acute. And in the development space, the technology choice is very important, obviously, but how projects get over the line is often a function of whether they work commercially, in the sense, do they make money and can we raise debt against this? Is the risk profile attractive or acceptable to lenders and investors? So because I've been working in the project space, I suppose, there are always questions about how we progress the project or deliver the project that in the end come back to commercial questions. So you're absolutely right. No training, but a lot of exposure through my career, however that's worked out. And I think understanding a little bit about the different perspectives has helped a lot as well. You know, being able to empathize why people are worried about stuff, because I've to a certain extent sat in there. I've been in their shoes, if you like. So it's purely by accident, but I think that happens to a lot of engineers. You know, you go to uni, you study how to do all the maths, and then you get into the real world, and the first question is that our risk or is that their risk? And did you tell them last Wednesday how big the thing was? You know, and immediately that's it, you're in there.
Indeed. I can imagine myself working in Sydney Metro some years ago when I first got asked, so how much money have we spent this month and are we on track? And I was like, what? I thought my job was to make sure we pour the concrete right. And that really hit me hard in the sense that, oh, wow, I need to learn about this. And it's either you're in or you're out. It's not just about, pouring concrete, as you said, right?
Well, I think there's an assumption that the concrete will be poured correctly. And the question is, when will it happen?
Yeah, indeed. All right. Well, now talking contractual literacy, or let's say legal literacy, I think that is very, very important. And I take that to heart, which is why I'm here in this podcast with you, which is what Society of Construction Law Australia podcast Building Tomorrow is all about at the moment. Now, let's look at industry contracting models. We'll touch on some of the current models that have been there, and then again, we'll move a bit forward about where things are going. Let's start with, what are the usual contracting models used in onshore wind farm industry?
Well, this is, in a way, quite a big question. If we start with Australia, historically in Australia, the typical way that onshore wind projects have been organised is through an EPC contract with the wind turbine manufacturer taking on that role, and they will subcontract out a civil balance of plant, the electrical balance of plant, and they might have a third package, which is installation, and that's cranes and electrical and mechanical completion works as well. That's a pretty standard way to do it. And of course, there's many, many other ways that they structure it, but that's probably the main theme, that EPC structure. And I'm conscious that this is a podcast that probably will be heard by lots of lawyers, so I don't want to tell them what they know. But my understanding, based on talking to people and my experience, is that Australia has a bit of a culture around EPC and infrastructure, and that's made its way into wind. And I should preface this, there are obviously some projects that have been done in a different way. They've been done in sort of a split contract way, and normally that's where the project hasn't needed to raise a whole lot of non-recourse finance against the project structure, because when you don't do that, or maybe you raise slightly less debt as a portion of the construction funds that are required, then the lenders tend to give you a bit more latitude to take on risk. But if we consider the majority of projects, which are, a special purpose vehicle that is going to build the wind farm, and the debt is going to be raised against the special purpose vehicle, non-recourse finance. So that means you can't go to the parent company to cover the debt. It's all supposed to be within the wind farm, if you like. In that case, lenders in Australia have, to a certain extent, led a charmed life where they've been able to ask for EPC contracts, which my understanding is attractive to lenders because they've got one person to pursue if it goes badly and they want to get liquidated damages. So, that's Australia. You also see similar structures in, emerging markets like South America. You see EPC a lot. But I guess markets that are less mature, you tend to see more EPC structures. And I think we should leave China aside because China is sort of its own thing. And I don't actually know how the contracting is there, and I can't really speak to that. But certainly in Europe, very rarely would you see an EPC structure. And the same in the United States. They have a concept that they call EPC, but what happens is a tier one construction contractor will deliver everything except the wind turbines. So this construction contractor, sometimes they call themselves an EPC contractor, They will do everything, and then the turbine company will just deliver the turbines to site and leave site and come back once they've been erected and electrically and mechanically completed, just to commission the turbines. So that's a pretty typical method in America. And in Europe, it's very typical that you'll have 2 or 3 packages. You'll have the electrical, the civil, balance of plant, and you'll have the turbines all done separately. That's very typical. And that's, you can go and get your finance against that in Europe. That's no problem. But I think it is worth dwelling on the differences. The projects in Australia tend to be huge, and the projects in Europe tend to be much, much smaller. So maybe the risk profile from a lender's point of view is very, very different. And the market's clearly more mature over there in most European countries. And look, the projects in the States are very big, but for whatever reason, they've landed at that model where you've got 2 contractors involved, and that's pretty typical. There's different models in Australia where really set on the EPC. And I guess the exciting thing from my point of view, that seems to be changing. And we're seeing more and more people talk about split scope, whether that's having 2 entities directly contracting with the wind farm to do the construction, or 3, or I did speak to someone the other day who was talking about 5 or 6. So yeah, it feels like it's a dynamic space, which is really interesting. And I think it's the way forwards. It means developers can be more in charge of their projects and hopefully improve the price of the projects, which will make electricity cheaper for everybody, because they can take out a bit of margin by doing management themselves.
Absolutely. Now, when you say price of electricity, let's hook on to that for a moment. We're talking onshore wind farm and price of electricity. How does it affect the price of electricity? I'm aware of the concept called levelized cost of energy, if that's the right term, LCOE. Is that something you're talking about just then?
For sure, yes. So at the simplest level, the levelized cost of energy should theoretically go down if you break up the construction contracts, because there'll be less margin in them. If you've got an EPC contractor who gets 2 or 3 parties beneath them, they will put margin on the margin those guys have put on, right? So 10% on 10%. So theoretically, splitting it up should take out margin, and you should be able to do the management for less than the cost of the margin, theoretically. But I guess what I'm really getting at is when a wind farm is developed and when they reach financial close, it's very standard to have a power purchase agreement, and that'll be with Energy Australia, or that'll be with, back in the day, although it's a little bit less common now, a corporate entity like Telstra or Wesfarmers or what have you, or a state government. And that PPA is typically structured as a fixed price per megawatt hour of energy. They'll have to pass that on, right, to their retail and business customers. So if, because of improvements in the cost or reductions in the construction cost because of different ways of doing the delivery, a retailer can pass through a slightly cheaper cost of energy. That's sort of, I'm keeping it quite simple there because, to be frank, I'm not an expert in how the retailers do their business, but that's the way that the cost of building and operating wind farms, or indeed solar farms, flows through to the price that you and I pay each month.
Absolutely. None of us are experts in everything, but indeed you are an expert in helping the wind farm projects get up. So I think whether you like it or not, you have to be able to understand what's going on the other side and be able to commercially negotiate on what's good for them and what's good for the developer. Don't you agree?
100%. Yeah. If you don't understand what everybody in a negotiation would like, it's very hard to find a landing point that everybody's excited about.
Absolutely. Now let's explore the split scope contracting a bit more. What would you say are some of the key differences between a single, let's say a full wrap EPC contract versus a split scope contract?
Sure. I think the first thing to just clarify, a full scope EPC contract in practice is not a full wrap, right? There will be certain things. There'll be certain things that those parties will not take the risk on, and they will hand that back to the developer. So, ground risk is a classic example that I think people will be familiar with from all sorts of construction contracts in many industries. Wind risk is a special one for the wind industry. When it's too windy, you can't assemble wind turbines with the crane, right? It's too dangerous. So you have wind days where it's too windy, and often contractors will say, well, that's not our fault. We'll have an extension automatically if it's too windy, that sort of thing. So just because it says full wrap on the tin doesn't mean there's no risk with the developer. But the key difference, that notwithstanding, the key difference is if you've sought an EPC agreement for the construction, the idea is if they're late, then you can have some liquidated damages as the principle. It needs to be in proportion to the loss experienced by the principal. I'm sure the lawyers listening have a better definition, but in the wind industry, that normally means that you work out approximately how many megawatt hours of energy you missed out on, you multiply that by the PPA rate, and then you've got a liquidated damages rate. And if it's all wrapped up and there's only one contractor, then no matter what goes wrong, unless it's been carved out, but no matter what goes wrong, it sits with one party, very straightforward. Once you've got multiple parties, the risk is that one party will be late, affect the second one, and the developer's left holding the issue. So the classic example is the guys doing the foundations are very slow, and they're so slow that the wind turbine company cannot start installing the wind turbines on time. And then your project will finish late. You will start generating later than planned, and then you will start generating revenues later than planned, and then you will start paying off your debt later than planned. So you'll incur extra interest. So the project will be less profitable because there's more debt against it. So this is a pretty simplistic example, but this is one of the key differences. That risk sits with the developer, whereas if that was an EPC agreement, the one contractor did the foundations and the turbines, and it doesn't matter what went wrong, you just pursue them. And in that second example, you could pursue the foundation guys, of course, but their contract value would be, I don't know, what a civil contract for a wind farm is probably only worth 10 to 15% of the total construction price. So even if you took a whole bunch of delay damages from them, their cap will be in proportion to their value contribution to the project. And so the money that you recoup there will be much, much smaller than the damages that you actually incur at the end. So that's the risk. The upside is if you're the developer, you know what's happening. There's no several layers of management to get through to understand what's actually going on. The foundation is late because you're employing a company and you know exactly what's happening. So you can do things to mitigate. That wouldn't always be possible if you don't have that visibility and that control to take actions. So I think that EPC is sort of safe but expensive, and split contract, there are more options to get things done at the right price and at the right time, but you take ownership and also you take responsibility.
I see. Now, why have the industry participants decided now, compared to the full rep EPC, which comes with carve-outs and exclusions, as you mentioned, now going towards more of an active owner role where they are really interested in what's going on in the job? We want to manage it from, day one all the way to commissioning when they finally start making money. What do you think is driving this shift in the industry at the moment?
Look, that is a good question. And I think there are probably three main things. The developers that are now, or that are still active, they're a bit more mature. They've existed a bit longer, or maybe their staff have more experience. We've got to remember renewables is still a relatively young industry in Australia, and not that many people have that much experience. So I think maturity is one thing. People are a bit more confident, got a bit more experience, more likely, happier to take on more risk. A second thing is there is at least one precedent of a split scope contract attracting non-recourse finance in Australia called Rye Park. So people know that lenders will look at it, will support you if you structure it in such a way that they're happy with it. So they know that it's possible. No one, being the first mover is quite scary. Being second mover is maybe a little bit easier. But the third thing, I guess maybe there's four things. So
that's all right. You can have more.
Yeah, that's very generous of you. No, the third thing is the wind turbines, wind farms as a package are becoming less cost competitive as compared to solar farms. So there's a bit of a push to see where can we make some savings to get the PPA price to a level that is still attractive to, retailers and purchasers of energy. So that's a third thing, a bit of cost pressure. And the final thing, which is maybe the main thing, the turbine OEMs largely do not want to deliver EPC scopes. A lot of them have had some pretty average experiences and worn some big damages and generally had a pretty average time. So if you would like to go out to market and only have one option, maybe 1.5 to buy your turbines, you can go EPC. If you don't want that, too bad. You're going to have to do split scope. So I think that's driving a lot of developers too, because a procurement strategy that only has one possible winner is not really a great default.
I see. Although there are only a handful of providers in the OEM leading the whole project, it still seems to me that the choices are already not that many. And when you go down to this hard EPC line, like what everybody is so used to, you get down to even more of a hole with your options. So, yeah, interesting insight there for the listeners there. And by the way, it won't be just the lawyers. I reckon engineers like you and me will probably give this a listen as well, and they should. A bit of a plug here, but let's now move on to some of the considerations. Although this contracting model might be more preferred because, let's say, they're able to get financing, the owners are much more mature, and then the industry generally, even from a supply side, is wanting to move to that. Let's consider some of the things that a project owner or a project, let's say, tenderer, who might be a participant in this multi-scope contracting, what do they need to watch out for?
I mean, that is a great question. If we sit with the developer for a moment, I think they need to take it seriously. To deliver an EPC contract as the developer, obviously it's still quite difficult, but the team you need is not as large. You can, to a certain extent, outsource your design reviews and your sort of due diligence of what's happening and just have a few people overseeing the whole thing. But if you're going to split up the agreements, then you need to take things much more seriously, because if things go badly, then you will have that. So you will need a proper scheduler. You will need someone managing the interfaces very carefully. You will need document control. You will need to, monitor technical questions that are raised by the contractors and make sure that information flows in a timely manner, but also in a very sort of structured and recorded way, because that'll come back later for variations and what have you. So there's much more rigor and expertise required, I think, on the developer side. And I would argue that's best placed in-house in your organization and not handed out to a consultancy, because they're never going to have the same interests or the same drive as your own staff to make sure things go well. I guess they're not on the line in the same way as the developer itself if things go badly. So they don't have quite the same motivation. So yeah, basically you need to take it more seriously. You need to get a team, need to really do that well. And if you're the subcontractor, I think you need to be careful that you don't take on any risks that are not yours, because the temptation is always to try and push things down. And you don't want to take on a risk that's not commensurate with the value of your agreement. Look, I think a lot of the contractors know this already. They're already very good at this. But managing the interface and the risks that arise from the interface going badly, that's, in my mind, the key thing to understand and, be really sure about. And if, as a subcontractor, you can do a great job of communicating what you need to know by when, that'll protect you. And that'll also mean the developer can do a good job of at least knowing what they need to do. And if they fail to do that, then you'll have a clear case to raise variations and, so you should. But if it's unclear what information and things, prepared or things being in place on site, if you haven't really made that very, very clear and it's not there and it slows you down and you're the subcontractor, that's very difficult for you. And I think you'll be much more successful if you can articulate that really clearly and you're doing the developer a favor too, because they'll know what's expected of them.
I see. You mentioned just now that building an internal team is ideal to continue on developing other projects. But anecdotally speaking, wind farms, although they are large projects, they are not that many, and they are mostly consolidated. Let's say, for an example, I think Nordex is owned by another company which does these types of projects. I can't recall, but I think it is a little bit complicated than wanting to build out your internal capability when there's not certainty from a planning and approvals regime perspective across Australia, where you have effectively 8 separate countries, if you tell me, with 6 states and 2 territories. One project team would have to be across every single state and territory legislation and the planning requirements, which I think in itself is a little bit hard. And then now getting a big project across the line is a challenge in itself compared to Europe, where there might be lots of small 10 megawatt, 50 megawatt projects, and they're in, let's say, people's paddocks. Here you have to have so many different land agreements. What do you think about the practicality of that?
Wind farm development is not for the faint-hearted and it is expensive. And I think we will have a bit of a consolidation over time where bigger entities who are maybe doing more projects at once, or maybe can just soak up a bit of personnel costs and it's not the end of the world, they can execute these split scope contracts better over time, especially if they can have a team who can stay around long enough to deliver multiple projects and really learn the best way to do it. I think that's a possible way forwards.
Let's have a look at some of the emerging trends now. Now, before we get there, we've identified what's been going on in Australia in the wind industry so far in terms of contracting models. And, why has the industry shifted their focus from, let's say, a full wrap for simplicity to now split, and some of the issues that you might run into despite going into that split scope contracting, because nothing is perfect and you have to work on it. I'm starting to see that there is a lot of interest in battery projects. I know you mentioned earlier in your talk that you didn't quite get into BESS because it was probably a little bit early at the time when you were interested to get your career into a different direction, and so you chose wind. But I think in hindsight, it's not too bad because a lot of wind farms apparently are now coming up with battery projects as their shock absorber, maybe, for the grid. I'm not electrically minded, so I'll leave it at that. But what do you think about this new emergence? And how does that affect, let's say, the financiers, the developers, and the delivery teams? Because all of these things are going to require some level of cross-disciplinary expertise.
100%, yeah. Look, the BESS space is very exciting right now, very successful right now. I may not be aware that a few years ago, the lithium price moved materially, like by a factor of 50% or something really large. And suddenly, a whole series of BESS projects that were sort of waiting for the price to be right became viable, and we've had a rush of projects since. So that's sort of a function of the price being right and being able to make a financial model work without being too ambitious on the returns front. I think it is worth considering how you do financial model for a BESS just for a minute. For a solar or a wind farm, or indeed all sorts of other generation assets, it can be relatively straightforward in a way, especially for solar and wind. To a certain extent, you can work out how windy it is, how sunny it is, and how your technology will convert that into megawatt hours. And then I said before, to get the financing, typically you're expected to lock up a majority of that with a fixed price PPA. So the revenue is kind of defined, to a certain extent, it's predictable. With a battery, you're not generating anything. We're really taking advantage of arbitrage, and also potentially they talk about the revenue stack. You might be playing in the FCAS market. You might have an agreement with the state government or one of the transmission operators to do some special thing for them. That might be to reserve some capacity at certain times of the year. That might be to do some specific, charging and discharging for them. But leaving that aside, because you're not generating anything, if a lot of your revenue is related to arbitrage, then what you're trying to do is present the banks with a forecast of how much the electricity price will move in individual days for the next 15 years. And obviously that is very difficult, much, much more difficult and much, much more uncertain than a fixed price per megawatt hour and then statistics about how windy it is. So fundamentally, they're sort of a different thing to get rolling. So it is quite amazing that now a bunch of them are happening despite sort of the wobbly revenue, which suggests that the price of installation must be really good. But yeah, you do see them more with batteries now. Sometimes, in a shock absorber, wind farms need to assess the fault current in the place that they're connecting, and they need to assess some other key electrical characteristics. And if they're connecting to sort of a not particularly unstable, but a reasonably unstable part of the grid, maybe it's far away from major load centres, maybe it's got too much generation to really carry it comfortably, then you've sort of got three choices. In some states, you can procure inertia centrally. So in Victoria, for example, there's a plan where some synchronous condensers, which are big spinning machines that provide inertia for the grid, they'll be installed centrally in Victoria somewhere, and you will be able to buy a slice of that as a developer to sort of meet your requirements. In Queensland, that's not being pursued, and there you need to self-remedy, if you like. So you might install a synchronous condenser, which sort of sits there and takes 1% or 1.5% of your generation and does nothing else, purely as sort of a compliance thing. Or you could get some grid-forming batteries, which would do that job, but also generate some revenue and maybe also shift some of your generation to a more opportune moment to release to the grid if that's helpful in that particular location. So I think that's why we're seeing more combined projects, because the price is now very good. And if you can avoid installing a synchronous condenser, I think it's very attractive.
Now, for the listeners out there, I'll just explain some of the common technical terms that have been thrown around here. FCAS, to my knowledge, is Frequency Control Ancillary Services. And what I know from my readings is that if the grid goes down, then all of a sudden the frequency gets affected and a big battery can immediately, almost instantaneously, get the grid back to normal with that frequency. Is that right, Andrew?
That's pretty much it. That's pretty much it. I think we could imagine the grid as a big oil tanker, for argument's sake, an enormous vessel, and you're trying to go in a straight line. And one way is not enough energy, and the other way is too much energy. And when you have not enough energy on the grid, the frequency goes down a little bit. So normally the grid operates at 50 hertz. And if the demand is slightly more than the generation, it will trend down. And the converse is also true. So I guess this goes back to the synchronous condensers I was talking about, the spinning machines. So a big spinning machine wants to continue to spin at the same speed. It's got a lot of inertia. It's incredibly heavy. It wants to spin at 50 hertz. So when you have these excursions, big spinning machines will push the other way. They will resist change, but they're quite slow, right? Because they're big and mechanical and you don't really control them. It just sort of happens due to physics.
Exactly.
Yeah, a lot of power systems engineers are probably very upset about that. Like, of course, there's some control involved. It's more complicated than that. But in the end, it's sort of a physics-based approach, just relying on how they've been set up to sort of react in a helpful way. Conversely, when you have inverter-based generation technology, that can, in a time window of 5 microseconds, like almost inconceivably fast, recognize an excursion from the 50 hertz and push us back on track. So to return to our analogy, if you've got your big ship heading in a direction, the big spinning machines like the synchronous condensers and the coal-fired generators and what have you, they take a minute to react and then they push really hard, So that's a slow but really strong response to get you back. And if you set up those systems badly, then you end up zigzagging with these like big pushes from side to side.
I see.
Inverter-based technology, they can recognize the problem immediately and with much less force, and they can sort of apply less force in a way. They can push you back on track before you've even, just moments after you've had the excursion. So then they don't need much force. And the FCAS market, which, you got the acronym correct, that was absolutely right. That is where generators are rewarded for responding to signals from AEMO in certain timeframes for providing FCAS services, which is where they basically assign a portion of their battery to do this job of discharging and charging to balance the grid instead of responding to price signals in the wholesale market and making money out of arbitrage. They're busy doing this other task.
I see. Or in other words, I'd say steady a rocking ship. If there's too much rocking, then it's no good. It might sink. So if you can help to keep it steady, then you get paid, isn't it?
That's it. Well, you can imagine, in our metaphor, once the ship gets a certain amount off course, there's no pushing it back. It's happened, it's over, and then the grid goes down. That's it. So we want to keep it on the straight and narrow.
Indeed.
And these are the ways. These are the ways it's done.
All right. Well, look, we've had a lot of good discussion, Andrew. Let's discuss one last point here. We've discussed a lot about the supply side, but one thing that strikes me right now is the demand side. Now, what I mean by that is data centers are up and coming. They're already an established market as far as I understand, but they are growing a lot. Now, with the growth in the demand from the data centers, what do you think is going to happen in the wind industry? Who are the clear winners here in your view? And we'll probably call the podcast at that with some really good insights.
That's a great question. So I should first say, I'm not an expert in electricity markets, right? There are people who spend all their time doing just that thing. So this is sort of my observation from working in the space and then being engaged in the space as opposed to, me being a particular expert in that area. But from what I've read about the data centers, what I've discussed with people, the old data centers use a fraction of the energy of these AI data centers. But in saying that, each new generation of AI chips and sort of AI software seems to use exponentially less energy than the last chip that was released. So they're also getting better. although we are using a lot more of it. So it's sort of hard to say where that ends up. But for sure, that'll be a contribution to demand centers. But I think it's important to keep in mind all the other things that are going on. We're also electrifying transport. We're electrifying heating. We're electrifying cooking. We're electrifying everything. Your whole house in Victoria, for example, if you build a new house, that is an electric house. There's no gas. There's nothing else heating your house, right? So there's a whole lot of things being electrified, and we're going to see that go through industry as well. So an interesting statistic that I read recently was in Australia, the average person in a year uses between 5 and 7 megawatt hours of energy. In Norway, where they have largely electrified heating, they have made significant inroads into electrifying transport, and they electrified cooking long ago. The figure is more like 25 megawatt hours per person. So sort of leaving aside the data centers, which is going to add, I've heard people talk about an extra 10% or whatever, which is clearly significant. But leaving that aside, just electrifying our lifestyle, that's sort of a 5-fold increase. So in my mind, there's no getting past the fact we're going to need a lot more generation. And it's unclear where that will be. That could be on your roof. That could be industrial scale, solar and wind. But we're going to need a lot of it. And renewables, solar and wind in particular, are still the cheapest way and continue to be the cheapest way to do that. So I think at a structural level, over the medium to long term, it's really hard to not conclude we're going to need a lot more solar and wind to electrify society.
Absolutely. And no doubt offshore wind is going to be an amazing industry beyond the onshore wind, a wonderful complement.
That's it.
Now, look, I think the efficiency and volume that you've just mentioned about the electricity consumption is a very interesting point. And I certainly think that whilst the volume will go up significantly in Australia, the efficiency is probably not likely to improve. So if I was to say something, it's going to go up by more than what people expected, because getting more efficient is probably a bit harder than consuming more, because I'd say people can just buy more and more things. You buy a bad little heater, it'll consume so much more than a nice little air conditioner. So yeah, interesting conversation. Thank you, Andrew. Thanks for joining us today.
No, thanks very much for the opportunity. It was lovely to speak to you today, Bijay.
Thanks for listening to Building Tomorrow, the Society of Construction Law Australia podcast.
The Society of Construction Law Australia is a national organisation of members at all stages of their professional career with a shared interest in construction law.
For more info about the Society of Construction Law Australia, head to their website, scl.org.au. This show was produced with strategy and production support from Sound Cartel.
To make sure you don't miss an episode of Building Tomorrow, be sure to subscribe to or follow the show in your podcast app.
And while you're there, leave us a 5-star review. It really helps others find the show. I'm Mawuna Matanda.
I'm Bijay Lamsal.
And I'm Jennifer Raphael. And we'll see you in the next episode of Building Tomorrow.